Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Bree Price. I'm the WSU Bee Program Extension Coordinator. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar series. This is our second webinar of 8 webinars this year in 2025. I just have a couple of announcements before our speaker presents. So for our mission statement, the WSU Honeybees and Pollinators Program is a cornerstone of the College of Agricultural, Human, and Natural Resources Sciences, abbreviated CONORS, that is dedicated to fostering resilient ecosystems in Washington state and beyond. Our mission intertwines innovative research, community engagement, and education to safeguard pollinators that are pivotal to our food security and environmental health. In partnership with the Connors Resilient Washington Initiative, we're committed to advancing sustainable practices and pollinator-friendly landscapes and ensuring a flourishing future for agriculture and natural resources. We have 6 more upcoming webinars this year. For those who are interested in other webinars, please visit our website, bees.wsu.edu. You'll see a tab on the page that says upcoming events. There will be time to answer any questions after the presentation today, so feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box below anytime during the presentation. After the event and before you close your browser, you should be prompted to answer a short 5-question education and outreach survey. These are so important for us to help tailor the material that we're giving you. So we want to know what you're interested in learning about. Today's speaker is Dr. Taylor Reams. She's currently the lab manager for our WSU Bee program, and she was recently a postdoctoral researcher for our program. Dr. Reams earned her Ph.D. from Texas A&M University, where she primarily studied the behavior and population genetics of Varroa mites. In her postdoctoral studies, she studied honeybee nutrition and the effects of a novel honeybee diet. This talk will cover honeybee nutrition, what makes up a honeybee diet, and options for supplemental feeding. So Taylor, go ahead and take it away. You can share your screen and I will hide my video.
Okay, hi everyone. Like Bree told you, my name's Taylor Reams. I am currently the Honeybee Program Lab Manager. And here you can find my email address if you want to reach out after the talk. Okay. So my background, I actually started in Arkansas. My family has been doing beekeeping for 4 generations now, so well over 100 years. And this is mainly just backyard beekeeping, but it's kind of a family tradition. That's how I got started in the field. And I went after that, from my undergrad at University of Central Arkansas over to North Carolina, where I got my master's in biology. And there I also studied Varroa mites in Greensboro, focusing on behavior within the colony. And then I went over to Texas to A&M, and I studied the Varroa mite, looking at its population genetics across the US, as well as its behavior in terms of invading cells. And I then came to Washington for my postdoctoral position. So my background, like I said, is mostly in Varroa and understanding this pest. But when I switched to Washington State University, I started focusing on the nutrition of the hive. We all know there's a lot of different issues with the honeybee, but here we're going to focus on nutrition issues. So within the hive itself, the main source of pollen or protein is going to be pollen. An average hive can collect between 22 to 57 pounds of it per year, though you won't see it in the hive because it's not stored for very long. It's quickly converted to bee bread, which typically has a higher nutritional content for the bees. You can see the pictures here of the various frames of pollen, and I don't know about y'all, but I really love looking at the pollen colors, and it's really beautiful, and it gives you an idea of what your bees are collecting. Though between the different plant species you might have in your area, the amount of protein is going to vary a lot per plant. You're going to see the pollen mostly stored in the brood chamber. This is where they're going to be converting it to bee bread, and it will have really easy access to give it to the growing larva within the hive. The bees collect the pollen, of course, from the flowers, and they're going to store it on their back limbs and their pollen baskets, as you can see here. And some beekeepers like to collect their pollen from the bees, and you can attach these to the front of the hive. Um, and the bees have to kind of walk through these different sections, and the pollen falls off, and you can see what you're collecting. Some people might sell it or eat it, but our lab also looks at the diversity of the pollen that the bees are bringing in. So it's also a really good source of research for our lab. The bee bread that they're feeding to the brood is converted using lactic acid fermentation, and it has less cellulose than the pollen. And similar to pollen, it has lots of things like protein, amino acids, carbs, lipids, vitamins, and various minerals. And you can see this cross section here on the bottom picture of the pollen bread being formed and kind of packed into these cells. And so you can see the variation between colors showing the different plants that they're collecting from, which is a cool, I think, cool image to see. The other main source of food within the hive is going to be nectar, which of course gives them the carbohydrates. Whenever they bring the nectar in, they're going to store it in their honey crop in that foregut section of their digestive system, and they're going to store it within the cells. They will reduce the water content between 16 and 20%, and within the hive, they will convert it from nectar to honey. So how do the bees find their food? They actually do a dance, which you're probably all familiar with, called the waggle dance, where they walk in a line, going back and forth, waddling, and then turn around and do the same thing. The duration of the waddling part of their waggle dance tells the bees, the fellow foragers around them, how far this food is from their hive. And the angle at which they're dancing tells the bees which direction in regards to the sun the source of food is, because they're flying in a horizontal pattern, but the frame they're walking on is vertical, and so they have to convert it a little complicated. But basically, you can decipher the waggle dance of your bees and then find the source of food that they are collecting. And the bees in the hive itself, they will watch the dance and they will forage in that same area. There's also the round dance on the right here that isn't talked about nearly as much, but it's typically for food that's much closer to the hive. And what are the bees seeing? Well, they don't actually see the color red. Their vision of color is skewed more to the ultraviolet light section of the spectrum. And so that's why bees can't see the color red. And a lot of researchers, when they're doing observational studies within maybe observational hives or bees within cages, they'll use red light because it doesn't disturb the bees nearly as much because they're not be able to detect it quite as easily. So breaking down the nutritional needs of the bees itself, the adults in the hive do not store very much energy within themselves compared to larvae, and they will rely on the sugars from their honey crop. They also use trophallaxis, which is the feeding between the bees themselves to rely on feeding. And the larvae are fed by the nurse bees. These are the bees within the hive, the workers that are younger. The nurses will go around and inspect the larval cells. They'll stick their heads in the cells, and depending on what they find, they will feed. The larvae are giving off chemical signals that say, like, I'm hungry. And that tells the nurse bees, okay, we have to feed these cells. The nurses will visit the drone cells at a much higher rate compared to workers, which makes sense, right? They're much larger, and so they require more food, and they will be visited and attended to much more frequently than the workers. The brood food, the sugar content can vary a lot between 18 and 45%. So the nutrition of each part of the colony really relies on each other. So the adult nutrition within the hive is going to impact larval nutrition. They're the ones that are giving the larva food, so the quality of food and the amount of food, and the adults are also regulating the amount of larvae. If the adults know they don't have enough food, they will reduce the amount of brood within the colony. The larval nutrition is going to impact that next generation of adults. Of course, this is the next group of bees that are going to be nurses and foragers. And so if that larval generation isn't strong, then that can affect how they perform as adults in that next round of generation. And that in turn impacts the whole colony, because the adults that are in that were in that larval age, if they have less nutrition, they might bring in less food, which means the colony itself is going to be weakened. So it's all connected, right? And then what happens when the bees themselves don't get enough food? At the colony level, like I said, they don't have a ton of pollen supplies at one time. And so when they go into periods of low pollen stores, they may reduce or stop their brood rearing, which of course is going to impact the population of the hive itself. The adult bees are largely made up of proteins, and they can survive on just sugar water, just the carbohydrates, but they do much better when they have that additional protein in their diet. It's been shown that the ovaries within the queen and the hypopharyngeal glands within the workers are linked to pollen. The hypopharyngeal glands are needed for nursing behavior. And so if we have a generation of adults that have pretty weak or small hypopharyngeal glands, that could impact how good they are at nursing that generation and impact the whole colony. And if our queens are raised in a poor diet, their ovaries might not be as well developed, and that could impact her breeding potential and how many eggs she's going to be able to lay. Within the larval group, once the hive does not have enough proper food storage, they will begin cannibalizing that brood. They'll start with younger brood typically because they had less investment in their life. If their eggs are a few days old, the hive hasn't put as much effort into keeping them alive, and so they're the first to go. They also will cannibalize the drone brood because, as we know, the drones don't do very much except for mating, and they eat a lot of food, and so they will be cannibalized or not reared at all when there's periods of low food. And when these larvae are in a hive that has low amount of food, they might have a reduced body weight and size when they become adults, which can affect their ability to help the hive once they are adults. And here's a photo that I want to show of in a zoomed in photo of the brood itself. You can see in the top right corner, this larva has brood food. You can see it's laying in a puddle of liquid. These lower two are in dried up cells and they do not have any brood food. So this is something that you can keep an eye on when you're inspecting your colonies to see if your hives are lacking in their ability to feed their brood. So within the commercial beekeeping system, the honeybees can be chronically starved, which can kind of all link together. So if we have some commercial hives that do not have a sufficient source of pollen, that will lead to the honeybees being starved or malnourished, and that can result in a reduced lifespan or a reduced ability to forage or a reduced immunity system, which will make the hives less able to deal with things like parasites, like Varroa mites, or different pathogens like deformed wing virus, or the transportation of the hives between pollen sources. And that in turn can affect how well the bees are pollinating or how much honey they're producing, or if they even make it through the season. And that results in an insufficient pollen source because they don't have as much food coming in. And so we have to make sure that we're keeping the system stable so that they are able to perform their duties. One way to help your hives is to provide patties, supplemental patties. Sometimes they have pollen, sometimes they don't. And there's a variety of options on the market. You can see here, they're just these soft patties. They kind of look like peanut butter sometimes. And you put them on top of the brood chamber, maybe one patty per box that you hive box. And the bees will be able to feed on it directly within the colony. Though I want to point out in this top left photo here, that hive beetles, the small hive beetle is known to be attracted to these pollen patties and will lay eggs, and it can kind of cause an infestation. Now, up in Washington, especially on the eastern side, the small hive beetle hasn't been shown to be too much of a problem. But my experience in the South, they can become a huge deal where they'll just slime out all your colonies. They're typically a secondary pest where if your hive is strong and you don't have too much empty space in there, the hive can kind of keep it contained. But this is something that you want to keep an eye on. For feeding patties. So if your hive cannot maybe eat a whole patty, you can always break them in half. And that way they don't have a whole bunch left over where they're going to be infested with the small hive beetle. There's also supplemental feeding for just using sugar water. So you can see here a variety of ways people feed their hives sugar water. On the top left, these commercial beekeepers will put a hole on the lid and then just put a big jug of water on top, and the bees can feed from within. On the top right, you can see these um, feeders that replace a frame, and you just pour sugar water in there, and you can put a few pieces of wood that float, and the bees can sit on those and drink the sugar water. You also have these entrance feeders in the bottom left, and then you have open feeders on the bottom right, where you put like a container of sugar water in a field where you have your bees, and they all the hives can forage it at once. Though open feeding can cause issues like robbing. You don't want to do this when and cause a lot of aggression. They also can be a way for disease to spread. So it's not really recommended that you do open feeding. The bottom left, this can, in a time where there's a lot of dearth, the dearth air time, the hives could also come and kind of rob out these feeders if they're on the outside, and that can harm your weaker colonies and cause like a robbing event. So usually the inside feeders are best. You can get feeders that actually sit on top of your top box, and the bees, it's with completely contained within the hive itself, and that's also a good option. But I do want to point out that feeding sugar water to your colonies is a good way to see how healthy your hive is. From my experience doing top feeders, if I had hives that drank the sugar water very quickly, they were hungry, and I would feed them again as soon as they were finished. A healthy hive will drink it more slowly because they don't need it quite as much, but they will be able to finish all that sugar water. If you have a top feeder and you find a whole bunch of dead bees in the sugar water, from my experience, that's a sign your hive is very sick because the bees are not well enough to actually get out of that container. And also, it can spread disease because now you have dead bees in your sugar water. So keep an eye on how well your hives are feeding from these top feeders, and that can tell you how healthy your hive is. And that's just for me as a beekeeper, not as a researcher. So keep that in mind. During the spring to summer months, you can feed a one-to-one solution of your sugar water. And then fall, typically they'll up it to 2 parts sugar, 1 part water. That way you can get the sugar into solution. And then in the winter time, you can do sugar candy or fondant because you don't want that water to freeze in your hive in the winter time. So this is an option during the winter time you can use that won't have any water within it. So there's a lot of research going into providing these supplemental feedings to bees, and this takes a lot of time. You can see here kind of the progression of product development. So on the very bottom, you need basic understanding of what the bees need. You know, how much protein, lipids, minerals, and then you kind of go up the pyramid to different developing different formulations of these patties, and then these diets would be tried in within bees in cages. So they are kept in cages, and you feed them the supplemental food, and then you see how well they do. And then you can go up to doing these kind of tented enclosures where the whole hive itself is within a tent, but it's still very controlled, and you're able to look at the effects of the diet. And then you would scale up to eventually large scale field trials within commercial hives. And this is a really good way to test your diet because the commercial beekeepers have so many colonies. You can test a lot at once and see the effects in a real system that the bees are going to be in. So that way you know how much it really helps in the real world. So within the pollen itself, there's so much that goes into it, right? There's carbohydrates, the proteins, you have lipids, you have various amino acids, minerals. And so it's not just putting in protein and sugar. There's a lot more to it. Um, and you need to make sure when developing these diets that it meets all these requirements in their diet, their nutritional requirements. So if we have hives that are missing something vital, like a micronutrient, over generations, this can cause problems as each generation is lacking in this micronutrient. Similar to back in the day when sailors were out on the high seas and they didn't have vitamin C and they would develop scurvy. We don't want our hives to be missing something and then cause problems later on. So one critical micronutrient is 24-methylene cholesterol. And this study looked at how this micronutrient affected the honeybee physiology. But first, what are sterols? These are compounds that are found in their diets that are really important for the development of the bee itself. So things like molting and the cell membrane development. But insects cannot create their own sterols. They have to get them from their diet. So this paper looked at 24-methylene cholesterol using bees in cages. This is a really common method of study for honeybee researchers where they had bees of all the same age, they put them in a cage, and they fed them a very controlled diet. Um, and you can see here the different diets were two different versions of control. So none of this 24-methylene cholesterol. And then groups S1 through S5 had increasing percentages of the sterol. And you can see here, the y-axis is how much of this diet they actually ate within those cages. And you can see within the groups that did contain the sterol that they ate an increasing amount of that diet, showing to us that it's an important part of their development and their diet that they need. And how did that affect the body of the bee itself? Well, you can see here with the same labels, like I said before, the amount of head proteins and the amount of lipids within the abdomen increased as the diet increased in 24-methylene cholesterol. And so we can see that this micronutrient, which might seem like inconsequential, is going to impact the bee itself at a physiological level. There's also studies looking at how the lack of food, lack of pollen impacts the survival of the bees themselves and how it can impact the cannibalization of the brood. So this study looked at periods of foraging and non-foraging and the survival of the larvae that were reared in those time periods. So for 3 of the 4 time periods, or these situations, the survival rate of larvae within the non-foraging time was much lower compared to the groups of larvae that were reared during the foraging time. And it makes a lot of sense, right? When there's not enough food coming in, they have to pull back how much brood they can develop. And on the other side of this, the daily mortality of groups that were in foraging periods were much lower than groups that were in the non-foraging period. So we need to make sure as beekeepers to have a steady supply of food for our bees so we're not seeing this up and down in survival rates of our brood. They also looked at where these patties were ending up within the bee itself, the hive itself. What is consuming the patties? Is it going to the brood or is it going directly to the adults? So this paper looked at that and they found that groups, this on the graph on the left, where the various supplemental diets, looking at the adult bee guts. So they used 2 different dyes for A and B, graphs A and B, and they found that they were finding the diets in the adult bee guts versus the graph on the left is looking at the larval guts, which did not contain much of the diet at all. So this diet, the different diets are feeding the bees are going directly to the adults. They're not being directly fed to the larvae themselves. So this study looked at a few different currently available supplemental feeds on the market and how it influenced the bee populations before and after almond pollination. So you can see the four bar graphs. A is August and September, and then after the almond pollination, J and F. So looking at the graphs here, you can see that not all the diets are created equally. Some do much better in the hive, and some don't do quite as well. So Ultra Bee and Mega Bee in this experiment did not help the bees much during this wintering feeding and after the post-almond pollination event versus global 4% patties. You did see an increase in the frames of bees after the pollination services. So this shows us that not all of the diets are created equally. In some circumstances, some might be better than others. So my first summer here, 2023, we conducted two different experiments testing a novel diet for the bee. It's called Apex diet from the company Apex Biosciences. And so we had two different experiments. The first was called the parking lot feeding experiment, where the bees were supposed to be in an area they had very little food. So they were relying solely on our patties for food. And we had 48 hives to begin with, and then four different diets. A and B were these two novel diets. C was an Arctic available commercial diet, and then no feed was no patties fed. And we looked at the frames of bees and the amount of brood within the hive the whole summer, feeding as we go. However, in research, things go wrong. So we did not have control over what was being planted around these colonies, and they end up having way too much food, a very diverse diet of food. And so this turned into more of an experiment of, do you need to feed your hives when you are in an area that has a really diverse food source, not monoculture? And so they were located out in Othello at our honeybee facility out there, and they were assessed at various time points throughout that year, ending in like early September. And so we looked at frames of bees, so we counted the frames. We also did brood area using this grid here. And so each square was 5 centimeters squared. And so we were able to measure how much cat brood was in the hive, which shows us how big that population of adults will be in that next generation. And we found that for the brood area coverage, you can see that the best diet was diet A, but our no-feed control diet that did not receive any kind of patty actually did really well. It outperformed that commercially available diet. And we saw this similar pattern with the amount of the frames of adult bees, where the no-feed control did very well. And so we were able to show here that when your hives are in a good, diverse area, feeding them might not really help, and maybe it could hurt a little bit. So you don't always have to be feeding your hives food if you're able to put them in an area that is plentiful. Now, our other experiment was called the pollination stress experiment, where the hives were treated like typical commercial hives taken to various monoculture regions across Washington. We started out with 64 packages with this group, and we had the same diet groups as before, and it was the same summertime, so same kind of regular feeding. Our hives went to the blueberries on the west side near Mount Vernon, and then sunflowers out in Othello. The blueberry, I don't know if you're familiar, but the blueberry pollination is known to kind of hurt the bees. Typically, they don't do very well in blueberries, so keep that in mind. We found that our two novel diets, A and B, did much better with the average number of frames of bees compared to the no feed control and that already commercially available diet. As you can see here, the hives in blueberry kind of didn't really grow too much because they were brand new and they were in an area that wasn't great for them. But once they left, the two novel diet groups were able to rebound much more quickly than the other two groups. And so we can see here that if you are providing your hives with a good supplemental diet, they can hopefully overcome troubles from maybe a monoculture area that they're placed in, which will in turn make them better hives and better pollinators for the growers. All right, so that's all I have for today, but I'm really happy to answer some questions.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions in the chat. One of them is, should we trust pollen that is provided by someone selling nucleus or nucleus hives?
Um, so if you have frames of pollen that are coming with your nukes, unless I wouldn't be immediately wanting to throw those out. Like if they came from an area that wasn't great, I wouldn't be concerned about trusting the pollen. I think it would be fine to take it. Um, what do blueberries lack? So it's possible that the blueberries are there is a disease called European foul brood, which you might be familiar with, and our lab with three other universities is actually studying um, the spread of European foul brood. And some people think that maybe it's linked with blueberry fields, and it's not been shown yet, but you often see higher levels of it there. Um, usually just the blueberries, they might not get enough pollen and nectar from the plants to be sufficient as well. So the novel diets are not available yet. This company, we've been working with them for several years. They're out of Belgium, and they're actually working on developing their factory here somewhere in the US because of the commercial beekeeping field. And so that's something that I know they're working on right now, but it's not quite available yet. Um, so what brands seems to be better than others? So usually the 4% global patties, that's the one of the ones that we saw in the different diets being fed before and after blueberry. And that is shown to be pretty good. But it might just depend on what you have access to as well as a beekeeper. And you don't have to give them full patties. You can always break them up. Or, if they're larger, you might want to give them two. And you can also kind of watch how quickly they eat the food. So if they're eating it up really quickly, you could feed them more, but if they take some longer to eat it, you can feed them a little bit less.
One of the questions is, will I be able to review this session later? Yes, these are being recorded and will be posted on our WSU Bee Program YouTube channel.
So, um, where my research on Varroa mites. So, you can search, like if you go to Google Scholar, you can search my name and then in the Varroa destructor, and that can pop up. I have a review paper all about the mite, and we're working on publishing our genetic study with the Varroa mite. But I did publish a paper about how visitation rates to individual cells can influence the invasion of the mite itself. So Google Scholar is a great way to find my papers. So, when should we start feeding pollen patties? Yeah, you can go ahead and feed your hive as soon as you get the package. That way they have a good start within the colony. That wouldn't be a bad idea. So how do I know if the bees are in a diverse area? I don't need supplemental feeding. So if you're a commercial beekeeper and your hives are in a monoculture, I would say obviously that's when you need to give extra feeding. If you are in an area that um, is like a normal like neighborhood. It's gonna be more diverse, but you also can pay attention to the hive itself. Like I said, look at the brood, the actual larva, and see if there's um, a a lack of brood food within the cell. You could track how much brood you have. You could notice if they're cannibalizing the frames. It's going to take you a bit more to like pay attention, um, but that could help you figure out if you need to feed the hive itself. And usually the dearth when you might want to feed is going to be like July, August when that dearth period comes in, not a lot of bloom. Springtime, it's probably going to be fine. But as you get closer to July and August, that's usually the time you want to start you doing your extra feeding. When should commercial patties be pulled when applying? That's a good idea. If you're going to feed your hives or treat them for mites, you would probably not want to. I haven't heard any suggestions to always pull the patties, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to do. So if you're gonna go out and like use the drip method of oxalic acid, you could always wait a few days and then feed your hives. That wouldn't be a bad idea. Um, so since bees are not native and people are being encouraged to plant native plants, what kind of plants should pet plants for bees? Um, So typically the kind of plants that the bees are going to visit are ones they can land on. So flowers that require the insect to hover, these bees aren't going to visit normally. Like zinnias are really liked well by hummingbirds, but they don't really get visited as much by honeybees. Um, so if the plant can be landed on, usually that's a sign that the bees will visit. You could do a variety of flowers, and I would suggest doing flowers that bloom various times of the year, and so they have access to flowers throughout the whole year. So instead of having flowers that only plant or bloom in spring, you could have sections that bloom also in July and August, or even in like September, and that way the amount of food is available for multiple months. Is what I usually suggest. So there's something that we can temporarily do to help bees pollinating blueberries. So other than feeding the bees themselves, um, having like row, like in between flower or in between the crops, having areas of foraging that's extra is also really good. There's a program called I can't remember what it's called actually, Feed for Bees, I want to say, but it encourages with between these crop plants to have rows of like clover or like mint or whatever you want that it gives them more food. So I would really suggest having like a row of wildflowers or whatever near these plants that can kind of fill in the gaps of the diet that the blueberries do not fill. So the 24 methylene cholesterol, it's going to be in the diet themselves, the flowers. And so having a variety of plants would probably help improve the amount of 24 methylene cholesterol. So garden catalogs are offering pollenless sunflower seeds. If we go sunflowers for our bees, should we avoid these? You don't have to avoid the plants that don't have pollen. If you want to plant those, I encourage you to do so, but you could just have a variety. I think the key is to have a variety. Um, the sunflowers are not going to harm the bees, if you have them there. So I wouldn't worry too much about planting those. So let's see. Uh, does having an abundance of certain flower plant help nutrition? So I know there are a few that the bees really love. In particular, clover is a great source for the bees. And some people will, instead of having normal grass, which is basically a desert, our turf grass doesn't provide a lot for our bees. So some people do ground cover as clover. And that's a great option for bees. That's kind of costly and time consuming. And, if you're a homeowner, I don't know if you want to do it, but even having an area of your yard converted to clover or something that does flower, is a great source of nutrition for the bees. And it looks nice too. If I follow this correctly, supplemental feeding only becomes necessary when there's lack of diversity. Yes, I agree. So, if you're in an area that again has good diversity, you don't always need to feed. And you could always test it too. You could always test your hives with the patties, and if they don't really consume it and they're doing well, then you could assume like, okay, maybe I don't really need to feed right now. Back to the blueberries, would it be more likely to happen near a monoculture as opposed to, yes, yeah, exactly. Because if you have a small patch in your backyard or you have a few plants that you grow every year, that's not going to kill the bees in your area. If there is a variety of plants in your yard, those bees will just avoid the blueberries and they'll go over to your clover instead. And so that's not going to be something that you're not going to harm your bees by having a few patches of blueberries in your backyard. I wouldn't like rip out your plants at all. Um, During the flow and honey supers are in place, I don't feed them. Yeah, exactly. So, people typically will avoid giving the sugar water. Like after you harvest, you can give sugar water. Um, but the bees, if they have enough food in their area, they're not going to convert that sugar water directly to honey. But if you want to wait until your supers are off, that's a good idea. You could definitely do that. Can you talk a little bit more about how the healthy colonies drink less sugar? So this is coming from me as a beekeeper. Um, while I was doing research, I had a lot of sick hives because I dealt with mites. And so I had a whole bunch of mite hives. And I would always feed them because in Texas, the dearth, it would hit them hard. So I would always give them sugar water. And this, when you ask 10 beekeepers a question, you get 11 answers. This is definitely one of those things where our beekeeper at the time, he told me that um, when your hives are sick, they can't crawl out of those feeders. And so I would always notice when my hives started to die in my sugar I was giving them, the hive usually didn't make it. And so if the hive is healthy, they don't need that much sugar water. They're not going to drink it very quickly because they have their own source of nectar. So that's why they drink it more slowly. And if they drink it very quickly, then they're not dying yet, I would say, but they probably could use some more. So if they're healthy, they don't need as much. They'll just drink it slower, basically. Okay. Small hive beetles do love pollen patties. You're right. Where have the small hive beetle been found in Washington State? I believe it's on the west side, and Bree can verify that for me. Um, on the east side, they don't quite they have to pupate in the soil, and so over here in Eastern Washington, they don't do nearly as well. I don't know if it's because it's more dry or maybe just the temperature itself, maybe both. But you might see them in your hives on the west side. Sometimes what you can do that's kind of cheaper maybe is to get those Swiffer pads that you use for your floors. You can cut those up and put them on the top box of your hive. And usually you'll find that the beetles in that top box, but they'll walk over it and they get stuck in it. And that's a great way to capture your beetles and get them out of there. It's a bit cleaner than using those little strips with the oil. That can be kind of messy. So if you could get some like cheap box of those Swiffer pads, maybe off-brand, cut them up, and that's a great way to get rid of your small hive beetles.
Yeah, and to add to that, more information about the West Side. We've seen them in Whatcom County and Skagit County, and I'm gonna put a link to our small hive beetle fact sheet in the chat. You can
Oh,
download
great.
it for free off of the extension website. But this goes over what Taylor was just saying, like some ways you can culturally control these mites
Hmm.
without using chemicals right away, because really the chemicals that are available. For small hive beetle control are pretty toxic to the bees and really should only be used in like a worst case scenario in our region. Um, so you can see a map that shows habitat suitability in that fact sheet, and it'll show you if you're in an area where is more suitable for small hive beetles, that would be a time to be more like conscientious of your pollen patties during certain times of year.
Right. Yeah, and I would really consider them like a secondary pest, but I also was much more used to them down in the South. So maybe I'm just like gotten immune to being worried about them. But if you don't give your hive too much space, typically they'll manage the small hive beetle infection or infestation better, is what I've noticed. And they do fly from hive to hive. So, is the blueberry issue the same elsewhere? From what I understand, I don't think they're nearly as the issue is bad in Maine. I'm not super familiar with it though, so I could be wrong, but I have heard it's not nearly as bad up there in Maine. Um, when purchasing the commercial patties, are there differences what I should be looking for? Um, let's see. So I guess one that main difference is sometimes there is pollen within the patties themselves, and sometimes they're pollen free. So they might have a different source of protein within the hive or the patty if there's no the pollen. So I guess that would depend on if you want to introduce pollen. So maybe if you don't really want to have an outside source of the pollen that you don't know where it came from, you could look for one that does not include that could be an option for you. Um, I'm most familiar with using the Global 4% patties, which does have a 4% content of pollen. How long is sugar good in the high before it goes bad? And how can we do to prolong this? So I, how long can it stay in there? If you don't have bees dying within the sugar water, I think it can last a while. Usually you can tell from the smell, honestly. And so if it smells kind of rancid, you can like, dump it out. And you could also, if you say your hive isn't eating it quite fast enough, you could always put less in there. It might take you longer to go, you have to go back and add more, but you don't have to give it a full container of sugar water. You can give them a little bit, and that way it doesn't go bad if they're eating it really slow. So are there types of plants that I should avoid in terms of pollen or nectar? Uh, so let's see. If you're doing like monoculture, I would avoid, like they don't tend to do very well on sunflowers if that's their only source of food or blueberries. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily avoid any certain type of native flower. They're not going to it's not going to hurt you or the bees. They might just avoid it. I have been told that, some plants don't make a very good tasting honey. Like, mint is known to be a bad tasting honey, but the bees do pretty well on it. Another thing that's doesn't make very good tasting honey is goldenrod, which in the South is everywhere. It's like a tall plant and it's yellow and it's kind of wispy, and it usually blooms like in September to October. It's 'cause it's so hot down there. It's a great source of food for the bee, but my grandfather called it smelly sock honey, so it smells kind of funky. You can like air it out, so you probably wouldn't want to sell that honey, but it typically will bloom after you do your honey harvest. So it's a good source of the bees that they would keep that you wouldn't want to collect. Adding thymol. So thymol is used for mite control. I would imagine maybe you would do it more in a kind of drip method versus putting it in a container. But using, thymol is not going to control the mite population as well as like oxalic acid or amitraz. You could try it out if you want to avoid those chemicals, though. I don't know if you're going to see very good results. I am not familiar if that plant you're talking about, Cheryl, is toxic. But if it is toxic, I would also imagine the bees would avoid it. So unless it's like a huge problem, you could get rid of it, but I don't know if it would be necessary. And then I've seen some good results with the flower weed Borg. I'm not familiar with it. But if you see your bees going to that plant a lot, then maybe it is a good source of food. A lot of these good bees or plants that are good for the bees are kind of like weeds. Like goldenrod is a weed. It goes on the side of the road. Like clover isn't maybe a weed to some people, but it's good for bees. So it could be good. Um, I have an apiary that produces honey that tastes a bit like a fir tree. I don't know. Do fir tree kind of? produce honey? I do not know that answer. I'm so sorry. But you will get different tasting honey with when your bees are in different areas, which is nice. If it tastes good, I mean, you could keep it there and you could sell it and see how well it does. Do you have any opinion on the microbial supplements like man lake? So I don't know if these kind of supplements have much scientific backing. Um, so I've never used them. I don't know if they would really help. I'm kind of skeptical of things like this in the hive, but you could try it out. Maybe you could also do it with half your hives and see if it improves and do your own little experiment. But I would just be a little bit wary of like using these kind of products if they're not backed by any kind of study. Does access to water help? Well, so the bees, when access to water, they typically like dirty water because it has minerals in it, right? You know, if it's clean water, it's not going to have any like salts or minerals in it, but if you have a puddle, you'll see the bees going there. Um, and so I giving them water will help them, but maybe having it sounds kind of silly, but if you have like a puddle on the ground, they might go to it more because it has those minerals that are leaching from the soil. So, but access to water is very important. You can also do like kind of like a bird bath but with bees, and so you have a container and you put like pebbles in it so they can land in the in the water and drink. You could do that in your garden, and that really does help the bees as well.
Okay, so any more questions? I'll give it like another minute. You can put some more questions in there, and then I have some last statements. Oh, we have a comment here that says rain gutters with dirt and leaves attracts them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not surprised. And you'll see that with other insects too, like butterflies will do that. A lot of other insects will go to this kind of quote dirty water because it has those minerals in it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for attending this webinar. As a reminder, we have 6 more this year. So if you want to find out more information about that, visit our website, upcoming events page on our bees.wsu.edu site. Before you close your browser, you will be prompted for a 5 question, just really short survey that will really help us understand our impact of this event and help us tailor our events to what our attendees are wanting to learn about.
So,
Um, oh, and yeah, so
oh,
I will put a direct link to the website in the chat right now. There you
great.
go.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate coming in on a Saturday afternoon or morning. But yeah, and then my email is in the beginning of it's just taylor.reams@wsu.edu. And so you can always reach out to me there as well, and ask questions. I'll be happy to respond, hopefully quickly. But yeah, again, thanks for coming in on a Saturday.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye.